When Cindy told me she was pregnant, I was ecstatic. I had wanted this moment for years, a chance to create a family with the woman I loved. But my joy dimmed when the doctor confirmed she was 8 weeks along. Cindy had only returned from her business trip to Miami 6 weeks ago. At first, I brushed it off. Stress and timelines could be muddled in a haze of excitement. Cindy seemed genuinely happy, too, gushing about our future. We started making plans, names, the nursery, even talking about how we'd tell our families over dinner next weekend. Yet, there was a nagging voice in the back of my head. It was subtle at first. Cindy had always been affectionate, but now she was preoccupied, her phone clutched tightly whenever she wasn't using it. I shrugged it off. Work had been tough for her, and I didn't want to add to her stress. Then one night she slipped up. We were lying in bed, scrolling through our phones. She smiled at something and whispered, "Oh, Travis, you're impossible." I turned to her, puzzled. "Who's Travis?" Her head jerked up. "Oh, just a colleague from work. You remember me mentioning him, right?" I didn't, but I nodded. Cindy seemed flustered, though she quickly recovered, talking about how Travis was part of her team in Miami and had helped smooth over some project issues. Still, that name stuck with me. The next few weeks passed uneventfully, at least on the surface. Cindy seemed to double down on her cheerfulness, diving into baby preparations with gusto. Yet, small things didn't add up. She started taking calls in another room. Once, I overheard her laughing softly, her tone far too intimate for a work call. When I asked about it, she waved me off, claiming it was a client. My unease grew when Cindy's behavior with her phone turned obsessive. It was always on silent, face down, and if I so much as glanced at it, she'd snatch it up like it was a live grenade. Her excuses became vaguer, her explanations brittle. The tipping point came when I accidentally saw a message pop up. Her phone buzzed, and the screen lit up with Travis's name. The preview read, "Last night was unreal. Can't stop thinking about you." My chest tightened. I couldn't confront her then, I needed more information. The next day, I did something I'd never done before. While Cindy showered, I took her phone. It was unlocked, and I quickly opened her messages with Travis. What I saw made my stomach churn. Their conversation was riddled with inside jokes, flirty banter, and veiled references to intimate moments. One particular exchange stopped me cold. "Travis, you looked incredible in that dress. Miami sunsets have nothing on you." "Cindy, stop, you're making me blush. I can't stop thinking about that rooftop." My hands trembled as I put the phone down. The rooftop? What had happened there? Was this an affair? I confronted Cindy that evening. She denied everything at first, insisting they were just friends. But her eyes darted away, and her voice cracked when I pressed her about the rooftop comment. Finally, she broke down. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she stammered. Tears streamed down her face. "It was just one night. I was drunk and things got out of hand. I couldn't breathe." "Did you sleep with him?" She nodded, sobbing. "I didn't want to tell you because it didn't mean anything. It was a mistake, Jake, I swear. I love you." The next few weeks were hell. I tried to focus on work, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw her with him. The thought that the baby might not be mine was a weight I couldn't bear. Cindy promised to cut off contact with Travis and begged for a fresh start. I told her I needed time. Eventually, I reached out to a friend in Miami, someone who worked in the same circles as Cindy. I asked about Travis and learned he was married, a detail Cindy conveniently hadn't mentioned. Worse, he had a reputation for affairs during business trips. Fueled by a mix of betrayal and anger, I decided to reach out to Travis's wife. Her name was Michelle, and when I found her on Facebook, I sent her a message explaining everything. Michelle called me within an hour, her voice shaky as she confirmed that Travis had been acting suspicious since returning from Miami. She thanked me for telling her. 2 days later, Michelle and I decided to meet in person to share details. Over coffee, we pieced together a timeline. What emerged was far worse than I had imagined. Travis and Cindy had been seeing each other before the trip. Their texts went back months. When I confronted Cindy again with this new information, her reaction was explosive. "Why would you go digging into my life?" she screamed. "Do you want to destroy us?" "No, Cindy," I shot back. "You already did that." Cindy eventually agreed to a paternity test. Waiting for the results felt like a lifetime. When they finally came, the truth was undeniable: the baby wasn't mine. I packed my bags that night. Cindy begged me to stay, promising she'd make it right. But there was no fixing this. Every time I looked at her, I saw betrayal. Months later, I'm still picking up the pieces. Cindy reached out once, saying she had ended things with Travis and wanted to co-parent if I ever reconsidered. But I couldn't go back, not to her, not to the life we'd built on a lie. Michelle and I stayed in touch briefly, both navigating our respective divorces. She told me she was moving on, focusing on her children. Hearing her strength inspired me to do the same. Some wounds never heal, but I'm learning to live with the scars. And one day, I hope to find someone who values love and loyalty as much as I do. The nagging doubts I'd tried so hard to bury refused to let me rest. After Cindy's confession about the drunken night in Miami, I wanted to believe it had been a one-time mistake. But something inside me wouldn't allow it. My gut churned every time I thought about Travis, his name now a permanent fixture in the cracks of my marriage. I couldn't let it go. The silence in our house had become unbearable. Cindy's forced cheerfulness, the way she avoided eye contact when I mentioned the baby, her overzealous apologies. It all felt hollow. Late one night, while Cindy was asleep, I sat on the couch with her laptop. She'd been using it to book baby essentials, and it was still logged in. My hands hovered over the trackpad, debating whether to take this step. But curiosity won. At first, I found nothing. Her emails seemed innocuous: newsletters, work correspondence, shipping confirmations for baby clothes. Then, I clicked into a folder tucked away under a generic name, Work Docs. It wasn't work. There they were, photos of Cindy and Travis, smiling with their arms around each other on a hotel balcony. Another showed them at a restaurant, the angle too intimate for a casual colleague meal. But the worst was a selfie they'd taken together in a dimly lit bar. Cindy was laughing, leaning into him in a way that left no room for doubt. I felt sick. I clicked on her Messages app, praying it would reveal less than what my eyes had already seen. But it was worse. Most of the messages between her and Travis were deleted, but fragments remained, her side of the conversation, preserved by her device. One read, "Can't stop thinking about that night. Your trouble, you know that?" Another, "Don't forget to delete this before Michelle sees it." I slammed the laptop shut, my chest heaving. I could barely breathe as the realization hit me. This wasn't a one-night mistake. It was a full-blown affair. Cindy stirred upstairs, and I quickly put the laptop back. I couldn't face her, not yet. The next day, I decided to take things further. I hired a private investigator. I'd never done anything like this before, but I needed the truth. My trust in Cindy was completely gone, and I needed someone impartial to confirm what I was already starting to accept. My wife had betrayed me in ways I couldn't even imagine. The investigator was discreet. Over the next week, he delved into Cindy's Miami trip. He tracked down hotel records, receipts, and even spoke with a few employees at the resort where Cindy and her team had stayed. What he uncovered shattered whatever illusions I had left. Travis and Cindy hadn't just worked together on the trip, they'd spent nearly every evening together. The investigator showed me photos he'd uncovered through surveillance and tips from staff. One photo was of them sitting at the hotel bar, their heads close as they shared a laugh. Another showed them leaving the hotel together late at night, Travis's hand resting on the small of Cindy's back. There was also evidence that they'd spent time in Travis's room. Room service records showed multiple orders for two, with champagne listed on 2 occasions. When the investigator handed me his report, I stared at it for what felt like hours. There was no escaping it now. Cindy had lied to me. Over and over again. That evening, I confronted her. I waited until she came home, her smile fading the second she saw me sitting at the kitchen table with the report in front of me. "What's this, Cindy?" I asked, my voice cold. Her eyes darted to the folder, and she immediately went pale. "Jake, I can explain." "Explain what? The pictures? The hotel room? The fact that you've been lying to me since Miami?" My voice cracked, the weight of everything I'd been holding in pouring out. She started crying, her hands trembling as she reached for mine. I didn't know how to tell you. I was scared, Jake. I didn't want to lose you. You didn't want to lose me? I repeated, incredulous. You already did the moment you decided to sleep with him. And then you kept lying, Cindy. You lied to my face, every day, while I was trying to plan a future with you. She fell to her knees, sobbing. It wasn't serious. It wasn't love, Jake. It was stupid and I regret it every day. Please, you have to believe me. I was going to tell you, I swear. Her words felt like poison. You weren't going to tell me anything. You were just hoping I'd never find out. And now, there's a baby. She cut me off, shaking her head. The baby's yours, Jake. I know it is. I swear. How can I believe anything you say now? Her sobs filled the room, but I couldn't stay there anymore. I grabbed my keys and walked out, leaving her on the kitchen floor. I drove aimlessly for hours, my thoughts a tangled mess of anger, pain, and disbelief. The woman I'd trusted with my life had torn it apart. And now, I didn't even know if the baby I'd been so excited about was mine. When I finally returned home, Cindy was waiting for me, her face red and puffy. She didn't say a word, just handed me her phone. Take it, she whispered. Look through everything. I have nothing left to hide. I hesitated, then took the phone. I needed the truth, no matter how much it hurt. The cracks in my life had widened into deep, jagged canyons, but nothing could have prepared me for what came next. A week after confronting Cindy with the evidence from the private investigator, I noticed something unusual, a burning sensation when I used the bathroom. At first, I chalked it up to stress. My body had been under constant tension, my mind spinning with questions about my wife, my marriage, and my future. But as the days passed, the discomfort didn't go away. If anything, it got worse. Reluctantly, I scheduled a visit to my doctor. I sat in the sterile office, answering routine questions about my health and lifestyle. When the doctor asked about sexual activity, I hesitated. I'm married, I said simply. I didn't elaborate. What was there to explain? My marriage was a mess, but fidelity, at least on my part, had never been in question. The tests came back faster than I expected. The doctor called me in, her expression a mix of professionalism and awkward concern. Jake, she began, her tone cautious, your results came back positive for chlamydia? For a moment, I couldn't process her words. That's not possible, I said, shaking my head. I've only been with my wife. Her eyes softened, but her response was clinical. It's a sexually transmitted infection, Jake. If you haven't had contact outside your marriage, then? The implication hit me like a freight train. My wife, Cindy. I left the clinic in a daze, clutching the prescription for antibiotics in my hand like it was some cruel joke. The ride home was a blur, the world outside the car windows twisting and distorting in my peripheral vision. When I got home, Cindy was in the living room, flipping through a parenting book like nothing was wrong. We need to talk, I said, my voice shaking. She looked up, her expression instantly wary. What is it? I went to the doctor, I began, my words slow and deliberate. And I tested positive for chlamydia. Her face went pale, and for a fleeting second, I saw something in her eyes, panic, guilt, maybe even shame. But she recovered quickly, too quickly. Jake, that's not possible. Are you sure? Don't do this, Cindy, I snapped, the anger bubbling up before I could stop it. Don't lie to me. I haven't been with anyone else. And unless you want me to believe I got this from thin air, you need to start explaining. Her lip quivered, and she set the book down on the coffee table. Jake, she stopped, the words caught in her throat. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I leaned against the wall, folding my arms to keep my hands from shaking. So it's true then? You slept with him? Cindy buried her face in her hands, her voice muffled as she spoke. Yes, she admitted, her words barely above a whisper. It happened more than once. I didn't mean for it to go so far. I was lonely, Jake. Lonely? I repeated, my voice rising. You were lonely, so you thought it was okay to betray me? To risk my health? To destroy our marriage? She looked up, her eyes glistening with tears. You don't understand. You've been so wrapped up in work, in everything else. I felt invisible, Jake. Like I didn't matter anymore. Travis, he made me feel seen. The room spun around me. Seen? Cindy, I was here. I've always been here. You're the one who turned to someone else. Not me. You don't get to use loneliness as an excuse. She reached for me, but I stepped back, the thought of her touch repelling me now. I made a mistake, she pleaded. I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want to hurt you. You didn't want to hurt me? I laughed bitterly. You slept with him, lied to me, risked my health, and carried on like everything was fine. Don't act like this was about protecting me. This was about protecting yourself. Her tears fell freely now, but I felt no sympathy, only a cold emptiness where love had once been. I need you to understand, Jake, she sobbed. I was weak and Travis was there. He listened. He supported me when I felt like I couldn't talk to you. Don't you dare blame me for this, I said, my voice dangerously low. You didn't come to me because it was easier to run to him. You didn't even give me a chance. She opened her mouth to respond but closed it again, knowing there was nothing she could say that would fix this. The silence between us was deafening. Finally, I spoke, my words heavy with finality. I can't do this anymore, Cindy. I can't trust you. And without trust, there's nothing left. Her face crumpled and she reached for me again, but I shook my head. I need space, I said, stepping away from her. I don't know what happens next, but I know I can't look at you right now. Not after everything. I grabbed my keys and left the house, the air outside feeling sharp and cold against my skin. As I drove aimlessly through the city, my mind replayed her words over and over, lonely. Supported. None of it mattered. Cindy had broken something that couldn't be fixed. And as much as it tore me apart, I knew this was the beginning of the end. Filing for divorce wasn't a decision I made lightly, but after everything Cindy had done, it was the only path forward. I had tried to imagine forgiving her, but every time I looked at her, I saw betrayal. Every time she spoke, I heard lies. Trust wasn't just damaged, it was annihilated. The chlamydia diagnosis was the final nail in the coffin of what had already been a sinking marriage. I spoke to a lawyer within days of discovering the truth. She was blunt but professional, laying out my options and guiding me through the process. Because Cindy's affair had directly violated the vows of our marriage, I had solid grounds to file. Even better, the property division in our prenuptial agreement heavily favored me in cases of infidelity. It was ironic. Cindy had insisted on the prenup back when she was earning more than me. Now it was my saving grace. When I told Cindy I was filing, she didn't even argue. She just sat at the dining table, staring blankly at the paperwork. You really want this, don't you? She asked, her voice hollow. I don't want this, I replied. But I can't live like this anymore. You made that decision for both of us. She signed the papers without a fight. I think part of her had already accepted that our marriage was over. Maybe she thought she could salvage something, some semblance of a friendship, or at least civility. But I was beyond that. I couldn't bring myself to care about her feelings anymore. The divorce proceedings moved quickly, thanks to the prenup. I kept the house, my car, and most of our savings. Cindy didn't contest anything. She had no leverage, her guilt was obvious, and the evidence was damning. Her lawyer tried to push for a more even split, but when my attorney brought up the affair and the potential impact on her professional reputation, they quickly backed off. By the time the divorce was finalized, I felt a strange mix of relief and emptiness. On paper, I had won. I had the house, the financial stability, and a fresh start. But in reality, I was still carrying the weight of betrayal. The home I'd fought to keep no longer felt like a home. It was just a shell, filled with memories I didn't want anymore. As my life moved forward, Cindy's began to unravel. Her affair with Travis had violated the company's strict policy against relationships between supervisors and subordinates. I hadn't planned to expose her, but the details of their relationship had come out during the divorce proceedings, and someone, likely from her own team, reported it to HR. One day, I heard from a mutual acquaintance that Cindy had been called into a meeting with her boss. By the end of that day, she was unemployed. I didn't feel joy or satisfaction when I heard the news. If anything, I felt a hollow sense of inevitability. Actions have consequences, and Cindy's were finally catching up to her. Her troubles didn't end there. Travis, the man she had sacrificed everything for, turned out to be as shallow as I had suspected. Once Cindy lost her job and the divorce became public knowledge, he began pulling away. From what I gathered, he ghosted her for a while, dodging her calls and ignoring her texts. When he finally did respond, it was to end things for good. Cindy called me a week later, her voice shaky and desperate. "Jake," she said, "I need to talk to you." I didn't want to hear it, but some part of me felt obligated to listen. "What is it, Cindy?" "I'm struggling," she admitted. "I lost my job. Travis left me. I have no one. Please, I don't know what to do." Her words should have stirred something in me, pity, maybe, or even anger. But all I felt was exhaustion. "I don't know what you want me to say," I replied. "You made your choices, Cindy. I can't fix this for you. I just need someone to talk to," she pleaded. "Please." I hesitated, but then I shook my head, even though she couldn't see me. "You didn't think about me when you were making those choices. You didn't think about us. I'm sorry you're going through this, but I can't be that person for you anymore." She broke down, crying into the phone, but I didn't stay on the line. I hung up, feeling a strange sense of closure. For so long, I had carried the burden of her betrayal, but now it was hers to bear alone. Over time, I heard bits and pieces about her life from mutual friends. Cindy moved into a small apartment across town, living off what little savings she had left. She tried to reach out to family and friends for support, but most people kept their distance. Some couldn't forgive her for what she had done to me. Others simply didn't want to get involved in her mess. Travis, meanwhile, went back to his wife, Michelle. I don't know if she forgave him or if they stayed together out of convenience, but either way, it didn't matter. Travis and Cindy were over, and she was left to pick up the pieces of her broken life. As for me, I focused on rebuilding. I started seeing a therapist to work through the anger and trust issues Cindy had left behind. I reconnected with old friends, threw myself into work, and gradually began to feel like myself again. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. Looking back, I realized that losing Cindy wasn't really a loss. She had shown me who she truly was, and as painful as it was, I was better off without her. Sometimes, life falls apart so it can be rebuilt stronger. And that's exactly what I intended to do. Months passed after the divorce, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I began to feel a semblance of peace. Therapy helped me sort through the wreckage of my marriage, and focusing on work provided a much-needed distraction. Cindy was no longer a daily thought. Occasionally, I'd wonder what she was doing or if the baby had been born, but those thoughts were fleeting. Our lives had split, and I wasn't looking back. One day, while sorting through some old mail, I came across an envelope addressed from Cindy. For a moment, I debated tossing it straight into the trash, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside was a simple note, written in her neat handwriting. "I gave birth to a baby boy. His name is Mark. I thought you should know. I don't expect anything from you, but I wanted to share this. Cindy." The name hit me harder than I expected. I remembered her mentioning a colleague named Mark back when things had first started to unravel, someone she said was just a friend. For a brief moment, I wondered if Mark had been more than just a friend, but I shook the thought away. It didn't matter. Whoever Mark was to her, it was no longer my concern. I folded the letter and tucked it back into the envelope. I wasn't sure why she had reached out, but I knew I didn't want to respond. That chapter of my life was closed. Weeks turned into months, and my life continued moving forward. I had started dating again. Not seriously, but enough to remind myself what it felt like to connect with someone. My friends joked that I seemed lighter, like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. Maybe they were right. I was no longer dragging around the bitterness of Cindy's betrayal. One Saturday, I decided to spend the afternoon at the park. It had been a long week, and I needed the fresh air. I grabbed a coffee from a nearby cafe and found a bench near the playground. The sound of children laughing and playing filled the air, and for a moment, I let myself imagine what it might have been like if things had turned out differently. If Cindy hadn't cheated. If the baby had been mine. My thoughts were interrupted by the sight of a woman pushing a stroller along the path. Her hair was tied back in a messy bun, and her shoulders were slightly hunched, as if weighed down by exhaustion. It wasn't until she got closer that I realized it was Cindy. My breath caught in my throat as I watched her. She looked different, older, maybe, or just tired. She wore no makeup, and her clothes were simple, practical for a mother wrangling a child. In the stroller was a baby, bundled up against the autumn chill. As she walked, she paused to adjust the blanket, her movements careful and deliberate. For a moment, I thought she might see me, but her eyes were focused entirely on the baby. She sat down on a nearby bench, pulling a bottle from her bag and feeding the child. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but her lips moved in soft murmurs, her face softening as she looked at her son. I stayed frozen in place, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to get up and leave before she noticed me, but another part, the part that still felt a strange mix of anger and pity, kept me rooted to the spot. This was the woman who had torn my life apart, yet here she was, looking utterly human. Vulnerable, even. She seemed alone. There was no partner with her, no friend to help. Just Cindy and her son. For a brief moment, I wondered how she was managing. I thought about the struggles of single motherhood, the sleepless nights, the endless demands. And then I remembered how she had justified her betrayal, how she had sought support elsewhere instead of turning to me. I watched as she finished feeding the baby and gently lifted him out of the stroller. She held him close, rocking him back and forth as he began to fuss. Her face was a mixture of exhaustion and tenderness, a far cry from the confident, polished woman I had married. This was Cindy in her rawest form, stripped of everything she had once been, left to rebuild her life alone. As I sat there, I realized something profound. I felt nothing. No anger, no longing, not even pity. Cindy and I had shared a life once, but that life was gone. Seeing her now, I knew for certain that our paths had diverged forever. She was no longer the woman I had loved, and I was no longer the man who could be a part of her world. I stood up, taking one last look at her before walking away. She didn't see me, and I didn't want her to. There was nothing left to say, nothing to salvage. Whatever she was dealing with now was her journey, not mine. As I left the park, I felt an unexpected sense of closure. Cindy had her life and I had mine. And for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace with that. It was an ordinary Sunday afternoon when Cindy showed up at my door. I hadn't seen her since the day in the park, though I'd occasionally heard bits and pieces about her life from mutual acquaintances. I hadn't expected her to show up, and seeing her there, holding Mark in her arms, immediately put me on edge. "What are you doing here?" I asked, keeping my tone measured. She looked tired, dark circles under her eyes, her hair unkempt. Mark fussed lightly in her arms, his small cries a reminder of the life she now carried alone. "Jake," she began, her voice trembling, "I need to talk to you." I stepped outside, shutting the door behind me. I didn't want her inside my home. It was my space now, a place I'd built for myself after everything. "What do you want, Cindy?" Her eyes darted to the ground before meeting mine. "I can't do this anymore," she said softly. "I can't raise him alone. It's too hard. I'm trying, but I need help, Jake. I need you." Her words sent a jolt of anger through me. "You need me? After everything you've done? You expect me to just forget what happened and take you back because it's hard for you? I made a mistake," she pleaded, tears welling up in her eyes. "But Mark needs a father. He needs stability. And I know I hurt you, but I thought maybe we could start over. For him." I shook my head, trying to keep my composure. "You didn't think about stability when you were sleeping with Travis. You didn't think about Mark's future when you lied to me. And now you want me to clean up the mess you made? No, Cindy. That's not going to happen." Her tears spilled over as she clutched Mark closer. "I'm begging you, Jake. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm trying to make things right. Can't we at least talk about this?" "There's nothing to talk about," I said firmly. "You made your choices, Cindy. You don't get to come here and dump your problems on me because it's inconvenient for you now." Her desperation boiled over. "You're so cruel, Jake. I'm trying to do the right thing, and you won't even listen. I'm drowning here, and you're just standing there watching. Because I don't owe you anything. I snapped, my voice rising. You destroyed this marriage. You destroyed us. And now you want me to forget all of that because it's hard for you? You don't get to play the victim. Mark started crying, his small wails cutting through the tense silence. Cindy's face crumpled as she tried to calm him, but her hands were shaking. Please, Jake, she whispered. Please. I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was the months of suppressed anger, the resentment bubbling to the surface. Maybe it was the sight of her standing there, trying to manipulate me once again. I stepped closer, my frustration erupting in a way I couldn't control. You don't get to come here and guilt me, I shouted, my hands clenching into fists at my sides. Before I could finish, Cindy reached out to grab my arm, as if to plead with me one last time. I shoved her hand away instinctively, but in my anger, the motion was too forceful. My hand connected with her face, the sound of the slap sharp and sudden. Her eyes widened in shock as she stumbled back, clutching her cheek. Mark's cries grew louder, piercing the air. For a moment, everything froze. The weight of what I'd just done hit me like a tidal wave. I'd never been violent, not even in my worst moments with Cindy, and now I'd crossed a line I didn't even know existed. Cindy, I started, my voice shaking. Hey, what the hell are you doing? A man's voice shouted from across the street. I turned to see a small group of people approaching, their faces a mix of shock and anger. You can't hit a woman, especially not while she's holding a baby. It's not what it looks like, I stammered, raising my hands defensively. But they weren't listening. One of them, a man in his 40s, stepped forward and grabbed my arm. You're coming with us, he said firmly, his grip like iron. Cindy was still standing there, her face red and tear-streaked, clutching Mark protectively. Jake, she whispered, but her voice was lost in the chaos as the group closed in on me. Before I knew it, someone had called the police. When the officers arrived, they separated us, asking Cindy what had happened. She didn't say much, just that we'd been arguing and things had escalated. I tried to explain, but my words felt hollow. I couldn't undo what had happened. The officers handcuffed me and led me to the patrol car. As I sat in the back, staring out the window, I saw Cindy standing on the sidewalk, Mark still crying in her arms. She looked at me one last time before turning away, disappearing down the street. At the station, I was processed and questioned. They let me go after a few hours, but the damage was done. I'd crossed a line I couldn't uncross, even if it had been unintentional. The weight of my actions sat heavy on my chest as I walked out of the station, the cold night air stinging my skin. I didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was clear, Cindy and I were truly done. Whatever shred of connection we might have had left was gone. And as much as I hated what had happened, I knew I couldn't go back. Our paths had diverged, and this time, there was no turning back.